One person starting an important movement is Lisa DeLong, our next speaker, who's an RN, a bereaved mother, a writer, and the co-founder of Just in Time Children's House. She'll be talking to us about changing the face of death in America. Lisa?
Thank you. Thank you, Kyle. I've spent the last 2 decades trying to keep my sons alive. Justin was 5 years old when he was originally diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia, the most common kind of childhood cancer. He was in remission for almost 10 years, and then in the middle of his 8th grade year, the cancer came back very suddenly, and he died 5 months later at the age of 15. 6 years after Justin's passing, Jacob, my youngest, was also diagnosed with the same kind of non-familial cancer. Now, right about now, I can sense that many of you are starting to feel sorry for me. Please don't. I consider myself to be one of the most privileged mothers on the planet to have had a son like Justin, and I'm so pleased that I can share with you today that Jacob is now 14 years old, the epitome of health, complete with a great love of video games and pizza. Thank you. You know, it's easy for us to applaud life, but what about death? How are we doing as a society when it comes to talking about anything to do with death? I was sitting in my dining room the other day, and I was reading an article in a nursing journal that said, "America is a death-denying society." And at the same time, my husband had just turned the TV on, and the first thing I heard was a pow pow as somebody got shot. And then a couple minutes after that, it was the metallic sound of cars crashing and wailing. And I thought, we're not a death-denying society, we're a death-obsessed society. I mean, think about it. CSI, Grey's Anatomy, The Walking Dead, 1,000 Ways to Die. We can't get enough of this stuff. And I really think it's because we want to know more. But when the TV is turned off, the show is over, we get the feeling like that's where it ends. The bad guy is caught, and then we get over it. But in real life, death is just the beginning of grief. And grieving people are scary. We don't know how to talk to each other about it. Picture this. Super Bowl, about 6 months after Justin's passing, and I'm standing at a kitchen counter with a bunch of friends, and a new acquaintance comes up, and he says, "So how many kids do you have?" Safe question. And I think to myself, I've had 4, but Justin's gonna. But I answer, I've had 4 kids. My oldest son died last summer. Awkward silence. He stuck a chip in his mouth and beelined for the TV as quick as he could. But imagine a world where instead of awkward silence, a mother like me hears, "Really? Tell me more." Now, I realize that's risky for people. And it's because we all grieve differently. We all have different opinions, and we're all at different places in our grief. And we all grieve something. When Jessica was only 11 years old when Justin died, and I remember her coming home from school one day, and she was standing in the kitchen, and she was physically just shaking, just little 11-year-old girl just shaking. And I said, "Jess, what's going on?" And I said, "Do you miss JD?" We called Justin JD. She said, "No, I'm fine." And we went for a walk, and within minutes, she was bawling. She missed her brother. But she tried to put on that strong front. She's the strong one. JoJo was only 6 years old. And JoJo would come home, throw her backpack on the floor, say, "I miss JD. I'm mad that he's not here. I don't like that I can't wrestle with him anymore." And then she'd run out the door and shoot hoops with the boy next door while I was sitting in a puddle of tears. But that's how she did it. She's a straight shooter. It's easy to read her. Jacob was just a baby at the time, and he used to crawl around the house and wedge his head into empty spaces between the sofa and the chair, or if there were boxes. And as Jacob's gotten older, I've come to realize he's a thinker. He's that quiet thinking guy. He may look like he's hiding, but he's really thinking. And Dave did an amazing job after Justin's death and got his memorial put together, and then he went back to work. And I think of Dave as the doer. He found one other dad who was bereaved, and that was helpful for him, and that was really all he needed. So we have all these personalities. Me, big surprise, I'm the talker. right? I needed to be with other people and hear their stories. I needed to share mine. I needed to get mine on paper. I needed to give it words. And so I wrote, and I talked, and that's ultimately how I ended up writing my book, Blood Brothers, which is now required reading for nurses here at College of the Canyons, I'm proud to say. And all that processing and reading, I learned so much, not only about the process, but about other people. But what I learned that there are grief models that are very helpful for us. My favorite is the 4 Tasks of Mourning by J.W. Warden, where he identifies where we need to accept the death, feel the emotion, adjust to the new normal, and create enduring connections. And I like that model for me because I like the idea of creating enduring connections, and that this is a process that goes on, because I don't look at death as something we get over and the grief that goes with it. I don't think we get over it. We get over fresh grief, but grief is something we get along with for the rest of our lives. And the really important work, the gift in the grief, is the internal work, that private, quiet work that we do over time. And for me, that meant processing and really looking at some very profound spiritual experiences that I'd had. The night before Justin died, I was sitting in a chair next to his bed, and I had a lucid dream. A lucid dream is where it's very real. You may have had them yourself, where it's very clear and you remember it crystal clear when you wake up. And I dreamt that he was being resuscitated, and about 12 hours later, that's exactly what happened. And I still remember the feeling of the steel cold door on my hand. And then when Jacob was sick, about 6 months into his treatment, he developed a condition called VOD, veno-obstructive disease. And the doctor took Dave and I into a conference room, and he said, if things don't turn around for Jacob, you need to prepare yourselves because he is not likely to survive. And when we left that room, Dave went back to Jacob's room, and I walked down the hall to this floor-to-ceiling window at Children's Hospital, Los Angeles, where I could see the Hollywood sign and Sunset Boulevard. And I saw a homeless man pushing a shopping cart and a woman pushing a stroller. And I thought, what the hell am I doing in here again? And I raised my fists to God, and I said, quit picking on my boys. And in that moment, I felt a sense of peace pour over me from the top of my head to the bottom of my soles. And I knew that Jacob would live. The next morning, the doctors came in with Jacob's chest x-ray, and they said, we're shocked. All the fluid that was threatening his life is gone. And it was a miracle. We found out years later that no one had ever survived VOD. So here I have these experiences, one son living, one gone. And I never had a problem with believing that God had a plan. So I could see something in advance. Okay, I get that. But I didn't like the plan, and I still felt like a victim. And the answer for me came through a little girl named Elizabeth. Elizabeth was 6 years old, the same age as Jacob when he was on treatment at Children's, and I became friends with her mother. And when Elizabeth went home on hospice, her mother called me one day, and she said, I just wanted you to know what Elizabeth said. She said, I was holding Elizabeth in my arms, and I told her, Elizabeth, I'm so glad that God gave you to me, my only daughter. And she said, Elizabeth looked up at me, and in her very frail little voice said, me too, Mommy. I had to wait such a long time for you. And I remember I was standing in my backyard, and I looked up to the sky, and it was like it opened up, and I understood that I am not the victim of a brutal God, but I am a participant in a courageous soul plan. And that change in perspective completely changed the face of death for me. I don't look at death as this scary grim reaper who's ready to snatch away another one of my children, but rather as a companion and a friend who's ready to help me relieve myself from my skin at exactly the right time. And that change has allowed me to live a very full and joyful life, and it surprises even me. And that's why I value other people's stories. If Emily had never called me, and I didn't know what Elizabeth had said, I wouldn't have had that change of heart, my own internal work. And that's why I co-host Death Café Santa Clarita, which is a global movement toward talking about death-related issues in a safe, non-judgmental environment with no agenda. It was started in London, and so in classic British fare, it always ends with cake. And I love our death cafes. I've met shamans and professors and lay people of all kinds, bereaved people, but it's not a support group, it's just a think tank. And, you know, we're adults. We can get ourselves to death cafes, support groups. We can do these things. But what about children? Where do they go when they have questions or want to talk about death? Did you know that 1 in 7 American children under the age of 20 will experience the death of a loved one? 1 in 7. Very likely, many of you are one of those children. And when we grow up without resolving our grief, very often we become anxious, depressed, and sometimes violent. When my kids were grieving, I went and looked for support groups for them. I couldn't find any, not locally. Found them for myself, and all of the support groups I found were done in borrowed spaces, usually the back of a church, the foyer or office of a mental health building, or believe it or not, the basement of a hospital. Now you tell me, well, how many kids do you know want to go to a place like that? Mine didn't. Fortunately, we found a good therapist, and we still see her when we need to. But not everyone can afford to see a therapist. So picture this, a grief center that oozes of tell me more right from the curb, where artwork is displayed in the front that was created by the participants inside, and you walk in, and it smells like chocolate chip cookies, and there's a table full of art supplies, and a kind volunteer comes up to your child and says, so what does your grief look like today? Let's draw it, let's sculpt it. And then after that, we'll do your homework. We'll help you with that, because homework sucks when you're grieving and you have kids. And there's support group. Mom and dad can go to support group, and grandpa and cousins. And it's something for the whole community. There's even pet loss, because sometimes our pets are our greatest teachers about death, because we love them so much. I can imagine that place, and that's why I co-founded Just in Time Children's House, which is an art-based grief center right here in Santa Clarita. And we're brand new, but we're already hosting general grief groups every Monday nights for adults and kids. And I know that this model of open communication and safety works. And this is why. Because it's worked for my family. All these personalities and different needs over time. And they've had permission to grieve in that way. We've given permission to each other to grieve in that way. And we can still talk about Justin and Jacob, our concerns about his health that we still live with every day. And the way I know that this was got big confirmation about this recently was Jacob and I were at Children's Hospital for his 6-month checkup. We still go back every 6 months. And believe me, those are really emotional days as we wait for the lab results. And we were leaving, and Jacob turned to me and he said, Mom, I'm really worried about a friend of mine. He said, his dad is really sick, and he's afraid that his dad's going to die. And he said, if he dies, will you be there to help his family? And I just thought, this kid gets it. Like, he knows how to handle death better than most adults. He knows that this family is going to need help, and he can talk to his friend about it. He can have a conversation with his peers. And I held him in my arms, and I took in the scent of his Old Spice deodorant. And I'm so grateful that I can still say to him, tell me more. So ask yourself, what can you do to be prepared for death and its related issues with grief? And I would highly encourage you to attend a death cafe or something like it. There's many different movements going on, so that you can practice conversation around death. Your ideas. What are you afraid of? What are you thinking about? And get used to that conversation. You know, I was at grief camp a couple weeks ago, and a friend of mine said, so what's this death kitchen thing you're doing? And she said, you're getting so creepy. So I told her it's a death cafe. And I don't think it's creepy to talk about death. I think it's smart. So attend one. And the other thing you can do is to support your local grief workers. Who do you know in your community that's out there? Therapists, art therapists, people who do equine therapy. Support these organizations. Support my organization. That'd be nice. And lastly, you can practice what you will say to the next bereaved person you meet, because you will meet them. You will either be them or meet them. Jessica went on a date the other day, and she's going to kill me for sharing this with you, but she went out with a guy I call Hunky Sexy, because he is. And she came home from this date, and I said, how'd it go? And she said, it went pretty well. She said, I like this guy. And I said, why? And she said, well, when I told him about Justin, he didn't say, I'm sorry. She said, I hate it when people say I'm sorry because it makes me feel like I have to say I'm sorry, and then I just feel sorry for myself. And I don't like that, because that's not how I really feel. And I said, well, what did he say? And she said, he just said, what happened? What happened to your brother? Which is the same thing as saying, tell me more, right? So let's practice it right now. You're at the grocery store, and you bump into a friend, and you say, hey, buddy, how you doing? And they say, oh, my mom died recently. It's been really hard. And let's practice saying together right now. What would you say? Tell me more. Together we can do this and make a far more comfortable society when it comes to relating to death. Thank you.